PIB office manager and volunteer program manager. Today, I'm here to host a meeting and introduce our two wonderful speakers from the city of Portland. We're going to talk about HR pride in policy. I'm going to turn it over to Anne and Michelle to introduce yourselves, and we'll get started. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Happy lunchtime. Happy Pride. Happy Tuesday.
So welcome, everybody. My name is Anne Milligan, she, her pronouns. I am a senior deputy city attorney with the Portland City Attorney's Office. And Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Do you want to go to the next slide, Anne?
I do.
Thank you. I would love if you didn't mind putting your, it's going to be too much for us to introduce ourselves and everybody and get through our slide deck. If you wouldn't mind putting your name, organization, if you'd like, pronouns in the chat, that would be awesome. So I'm modeling, putting it in there. My name is Michelle Rodríguez, Chief of Staff to Commissioner Mingus Maps. I've been in this office now almost 3.5 years, but I've been with the city for about a decade in different roles. I started at Parks, I worked at Civic Life when it was still the Office of Neighborhood Involvement, and came into MAPS's office, as I said, about 3.5 years ago. It's so lovely to be here.
Yeah, thanks you guys for having us.
So I'm going to kick it off with just asking, hopefully you may want to engage, and you can do so in the chat or you can come off mute, but really talking about when we engage in discussion around how to build more equitable HR policies, a more equitable workforce, more equitable administrative policies, that it feels sometimes really big for lots of people. It feels like you are David and Goliath, and you're trying to take on this big beast that has been in motion for decades, if not centuries, especially when it comes to queer equity in the workplace. So one of the things that I was thinking about in preparing for this presentation is that there's kind of a lot on social media right now talking about microfeminism, and what does that look like for folks, and people kind of just recording themselves talking about these little acts that they've done. And in fact, when Anne and I presented to the Oregon Women Lawyers Association, folks talked about it themselves without us even sort of prompting about, hey, I've done these things. I removed all gendered language from our HR policies like in the 80s because I was their on-staff attorney, and I just did. I didn't ask anybody for permission. So I know folks have been doing stuff like this. So I kind of wanted to take a moment to ask if folks wanted to share what are some things that they have done either in their personal lives or in their professional life where they've done sort of these acts of, I'm going to call it micro pride because I'm just making it up. And how have you sort of helped to reduce barriers, or how have you built a more equitable organization in the work that you do? Happy to have anybody share and come off mute.
Folks can drop stuff in the chat too if you feel more comfortable with non-oral response. All right, so Michelle, this is your slide too, actually.
Well, we can pause and get feedback from folks on that question as we go through it, and maybe things will come to mind as you're processing the information that we're sharing with you. So for us, this is what policy development looks like at the City of Portland. And we understand that's really specific to a government agency, a government entity, but there are many things in which this will mirror how you create work in your own office, in your own company. I know that there are, looking through the chat, that there's folks who have different roles within their organizations. You may be the CEO, you may work in HR, you may work in legal. And so you have you hold different pieces of this policy making responsibility. And so we wanted to sort of talk through, how did we get to some of the gender inclusive and people inclusive policies that we've created over the course of the last 3 years, and what that looked like for us, what it took to get there, et cetera. So what are the core values, like sort of figuring out who your organization is, what are the core values, figuring out what are the policies that you believe are outdated, are ineffective, are inefficient, are inequitable, especially, and most importantly, figuring out who those stakeholders are, trying to engage them early and often and repeatedly so that you have not just buy-in, but so that your proposal actually gets better. And we'll talk a little bit about how our proposals grew over the course of our development of those proposals. Strategizing to ensure if you aren't the final decision maker, if you're not the CEO, you're going to have to get somebody sign off somewhere. So how do you involve those decision makers? How do you get their buy-in? How do you then communicate once that policy is about to launch? And whether that's just locally within your own firm or organization or business, or whether that's publicly because you want people to know you're a place to work for because you are making these policies to make it better for people to work in your organization. And then of course, launching it, what that looks like, training people on it is super important because sometimes we pass well-meaning policies, but then people aren't trained up on them and mistakes are made along the way. And then of course, with anything, evaluating. So a year down the line, 2 years, 5 years, figuring out whether or not that's the best policy, whether you need to update it because you've gotten feedback since it passed, since implementation, that you want to make it better.
All right, so kind of like starting from the beginning, from the first point that Michelle made, which is maybe one of those points that kind of get skipped over. Sometimes you're animated by a particular policy idea to begin with. You already have something particular in mind, but that first step really should always be, what are your core values that are animating the decisional process, and what kind of policy it is that you're trying to push across either in your own organization, or if you're, for instance, an attorney, as I know some of the folks joining us are, a policy that you're trying to match with the core values of an entity that you're performing work for your client, right? So these are cities' core values that have been worked through after many years of conversations. And so we have these 6 core values: anti-racism, equity, transparency, communication, collaboration, and fiscal responsibility. And then branching out from each of those, we have subparts of each of those 6 core values. So cultural humility, advocacy, mindfulness, historical and current context, integrity, accountability, empowerment, leading change, emotional intelligence, teamwork, peer support and training, intentional inclusion, commitment, clarity, sustainability, action, intentional partnership, and self-awareness. So if you haven't already done a kind of look into either your own entity's core values or doing that kind of work with an outside client, if you're a lawyer, I think this is a good place to start for a lot of us. I suspect that a lot of people that are at this training today relate to a lot of these core values. And so moving on to step 2, right after you've had that foundation of identifying what core values are going to be animating this decisional process going forward, and selecting which policies you're going to be moving forward, right? Because we can't do everything all the time. We can't implement 100 different new policies at once for a wide variety of reasons, right? It would be a ton of work for you. And then all that change management on the flip side is also difficult. So again, cementing where you choose to start based on your core values helps you with step 2 of identifying the policy. So there's a wide variety of ways that you can take that step to identify what is the policy that we are going to work on implementing either in-house or collaborating with our legal client to be able to move forward with. So we wanted to give you a couple different ways that we've identified policies that we wanted to move forward with, consistent with our core values. One is obvious, but it can be difficult to utilize for the first time, to figure out how to accomplish that. And that is listening to your employees. And we have that is really the core way that Human Resource Administrative Rule 6.08 on bereavement and funeral came about at the city, or more recently was revitalized. so to speak. So listening to employees is one thing. I think we hear employees' complaints, or we register them as complaints. And that's kind of the end of the action item. We hear it, we maybe sympathize with it, but we don't have an idea for what we could do to solve the issue that's being raised. You could have regular feedback events or town hall style meetings if you feel like that works for your workplace. I know that doesn't work for everybody. In this particular circumstance, this idea came out of the Queer Alliance Employee Resource Group, of which Michelle and I are both members. It was roughly, I think, 3 prides ago at a meeting, and folks said, you know, what do we want to do? What do we want to do to impact policy of the city going forward? How could the city show authentic, proactive allyship with its queer and trans employees? And something that several different people said was, you know, we don't see ourselves reflected in the leave policies. So what could we do that would help us feel more included in the leave policies? And the ERG folks didn't really have much more specific than that, but that was just kind of a generalized issue, because obviously as an employer, just like all of you guys, we have a ton of different leave policies for a wide variety of circumstances. So there's a lot of policies that folks were being left out of, but funeral and bereavement seemed like a great first start, because this was still the very early pandemic and folks were actively losing people in their lives that they weren't allowed to have the time to leave work in a meaningful way, right, on paid leave, not just unpaid leave, to honor all the people in their family. So that's why one policy came up. Another policy that we're going to talk about with you today, we were able to identify that policy through a formal equity review of the rules that was commissioned by Commissioner Mapp's office. Michelle, with us here today, assembled a committee of folks with different perspectives and different experiences, an attorney, some equity folks, again, people with actual lived experience, to take a look through literally every single rule the city has ever published in its current administrative form to decide where could we do better, right? And we can't fix everything all at once, but we can identify some of the highest priority issues that the equity committee saw with our existing rules. And so with that, we were able to create a clear work plan for the equity review, clear allocation of duties, regular follow-up meetings, because as we know, if you don't have it on the calendar, it doesn't exist, right? So that we could have that constant flow of work and allocation within the work group to make sure that the work moved forward. So just real quick timeline, this was our fastest policy that we were ever able to push through. This was the first big overhaul that we did of our HRAR, Human Resource Administrative Rule 6.08, which is funeral and bereavement leave. When we first revised it, it was just called funeral and bereavement leave. And by the time we were done with it, it was called funeral, bereavement, and pregnancy loss leave. Very important language at that last end that we'll delve into a little bit more. So we had a great feedback and comment period. So as I alluded to earlier, step 1 was that June 2nd, 2021 Queer Alliance ERG meeting, where they said, you know, we don't see ourselves in the leave policies. Maybe it will be a longer term strategy to make other kinds of family leave more expansive. But because we're only 1 year into the pandemic at this point, and we are actively losing people in our lives, people are dying, and we can't attend their funerals, we don't have paid time off to meaningfully access that leave to grieve the loss of these folks in our lives. So the very next day, I circulated a draft policy revising 6.08 to the entire Queer Alliance group for initial feedback before receiving approval from them that this was appropriate, that we weren't missing anything, right? Because no one person is going to encompass all lived experiences. So circulating it out to that group of 300 plus people to make sure we're not missing any specific issue. We got approval from that group to send that out to other folks for review. And then about 2 weeks later, we provided HR with our initial proposed draft of those changes to the funeral and bereavement policy. And then from there, it was also simultaneously spread out to all of the city's employee resource groups, including women's empowerment and PDX parents, so that they could have more intersectional feedback and comments on the draft policy. Michelle? This is where she organically came into the process, and it was huge.
Thanks, Anne. And I threw a link into the chat, which is now apparently you guys can't access it, which I had no idea. It used to be publicly facing, but it was a list of all of our employee resource groups and how we sort of allocate time and ability for employees to actually do that and work within their affinity groups, as they were formerly called, employee resource groups now. They get funded, et cetera. So anyway, that is another thing we can Google and figure out at another time. But to get back to 6.08, so Anne and I met and started talking about the language that had been developed, as she discussed. And then I realized that there were opportunity in this moment as we were editing this HRAR, Human Resource Administrative Rule, to add things that would help lots of people and without too much of a barrier to do so. And I had seen a news article about something that was happening in New Zealand with their young prime minister who passed national policy. And when Anne and I started going down the rabbit hole of Googling who had done stuff like this, and there had been some Asian and East Asian countries who had already done it, a much more narrow version of what we ended up doing. And ours was even more expansive than what New Zealand did. But we added pregnancy loss and to the language for bereavement leave. And on top of that, we removed all of the gendered family language. So it's sort of strange, probably for most of the folks in this room, where you see, sister, brother, grandfather, grandmother, when there's non-gendered language that's easily replaceable, sibling and or grandparent or whatever. There's so much opportunity to just sort of clean up your own internal policies when you think about how often we gender things in the States compared to other languages. I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and many words are gendered, but when you look at some formal policy, sometimes you see the use of the vosotros or você, where you're getting ungendered language purposefully. But anyway, these are small sort of pieces that we peeled out and started changing in the city, because I want to say it was like maybe late 2000, early 2010s, where the city had passed a removal of gendered language from all administrative rules. And that just wasn't happening because there was nobody really forced to do it. I think they did one wave and asked bureaus to go in and change their forms, et cetera. So if you sign up at a community center and parks, et cetera, but there hadn't been somebody really regulating it or policing it. And so we saw in this policy that hadn't been updated. So we figured might as well do that too, because this articulates what it means to be family in the city of Portland. And we wanted to ensure that we were pretty inclusive in that. So we updated this language. We passed it back to the Employee Resource Group and to the Bureau of Human Resources, BHR, to discuss that. We added fertility loss language because we got feedback from some folks in one of the parent employee resource groups as well. And then I brought it to council chiefs into their teams, and it passed. I want to say that it passed without much commotion or drama, but there was one commissioner who was deeply concerned about the funding aspect of it, or the potential financial loss to the city aspect of it, because that commissioner was in charge of the fire bureau at the time. This was, again, 2021. And because firefighters, much like police, uniformed officers have very specific overtime policies dictating who can sub in when somebody is out on leave, they were concerned that everybody would start taking this leave, and all of a sudden we're going to be paying a whole bunch of overtime, and then it would break the bank and the city wouldn't be able to afford it. when we actually did the math in the week between what is a first reading and a second reading at council when votes happen, we brought that council office sort of, I think at the end of the day, it was going to be no more than like 25K really, which in the city budget of billions, it was really nothing, and it passed unanimously. And then we added some language based on some feedback that we got from our labor partners later on. We adjusted some of the language. That was pretty easy and didn't require it to go back to council.
And I would just add, we've got 8,500 employees, in case anyone's wondering, proportionality wise.
Yeah, we have a lot of employees, and those 8,000 employees have families, which means this impacted quite a few Portlanders. And we started, a lot of folks have asked, why didn't we do this as a mandate for businesses that do business in the city of Portland? That, of course, is our intention to go there, but we figured we have to clean our own house first before going out and expecting other businesses to implement the same thing. So we wanted to start internally with our own administrative rules, because those are it was much needed to go through that. And then it made national news, and it didn't make national news because the Queer Affinity Group did a bunch of work, which it should have, in which we tried to redirect some of the energy that was coming from the news resources. It made national news because of one small piece, but not insignificant, but one small piece of the policy, which was that there was bereavement leave now for abortion, which essentially was, we said, if you have a pregnancy loss, whether that pregnancy loss is because you were trying to go through IVF and it didn't implant, or whether an adoption fell through, or whether you had a medical loss, whether that was, chosen to have an abortion, or it was a medical loss that you weren't expecting, that you need time to process. And there's so much stigma around what happens to our bodies when we go through that loss. We knew that we had to sort of break through that barrier. And in fact, was curious about the New Zealand policy is that it didn't cover that, explicitly didn't cover that. And Anne and I had these late night talks at like midnight when we were working the document, trying to decide, should we do this? And we're like, yeah, let's just do it, because at this point, are they really going to stop us for this piece of it? And in fact, it was not controversial, at least within the council at the time, but it did end up surprising people to make national news after the fact. And it was all positive, because we've only seen other cities then replicate it, other municipalities replicate it, and come to us to ask us for all of our sort of red line documentation to help them build out their policies as well.
Yeah, I think that really is interesting, because I'd just like to add that when we were hearing that dialogue from the dais, when we introduced this for the first reading of the ordinance to pass this policy, that commissioner that you alluded to earlier was most interested in what was going to be the financial impact of the fact that all chosen families and anyone who's like family was going to be able to, you could take bereavement leave for the loss of any of those people in your life, right? And it was a completely self-certifying issue. You just had to say, I promise that this is really someone who's like family to me. And she was convinced that this was going to be exceptionally expensive. And of course, in the 3 years since this has passed, we have found that it actually has no additional cost to the city at all. So even less than the initial projections. And another point I'd like to make is that this was a little bit of a lesson learned for, I think, Michelle and I both, because as I pointed out that language of the policy title a couple slides ago, that it's funeral, bereavement, and pregnancy loss leave. When we originally passed this rule, we actually didn't change the title of the rule. And after all the comments and feedback from all the ERGs and everyone who looked at this, we all missed this. And so I think that that's just a lesson learned, that one, that feedback period is so important. All that due diligence is so important. But we received objections from people after the policy passed, because by failing to change the name of the policy, we were assuming that pregnancy loss only comes with one emotional experience, right? And that is the experience of bereavement. And so shortly after that, we did amend the title of that policy to reflect that comment. So as the lawyer, I'm gonna just obviously point out some recent legal changes. Senate Bill 999 last year did expand the OFLA and sick time definitions of what constitutes a family member to essentially identically mirror that paid leave Oregon expansive, inclusive definition. So to the extent that you haven't already updated your family leave and sick time policies, you do need to make sure that you are doing that immediately, right? Family member includes all of the people that we traditionally think of as family, as well as anyone that you're connected to like family, right? It's that identical verbiage from the paid leave Oregon statute. So it includes all legal, blood, and chosen family by definition. So definitely take a look at your policies to make sure that you are at least that expansive as is required. But I think one of the things that Michelle and I really want to emphasize with these policy ideas is that you should be encouraged to make policies that are far more expansive than that bare minimum floor that's set by the legislature. So for instance, with Oregon sick time only applies to the first 40 hours of sick leave that are taken in one calendar year by an individual employee, right? But at the city, we've chosen to do a more expansive interpretation of that. It's not just the first 40 hours that you can take sick leave for your family members, your chosen family, legal, blood, and otherwise. It's all of your sick time. You could theoretically take any of your sick time. It's not limited to that 40-hour threshold that's otherwise guaranteed by law. So moving on to a different policy that we've worked on more recently, we have Human Resource Administrative Rule 2.04, which is city's gender identity non-discrimination rule. We went through a really, really thoughtful, slow comment and feedback period with this one because we really wanted to get it right the first time and make sure that no one felt alienated by this policy. So this is where that equity review that we talked about earlier kicked in, commissioned by Commissioner Mapp's office. So in May of 2022, we had already convened that committee to start having conversations about what specific policies most needed to be having an equity overhaul. And that was when I wrote the first draft of revisions to 2.04, inclusive of a new model plan for transitioning, detransitioning, and retransitioning employees to have that more inclusive language for the totality of transition possibilities, especially modeled after Professor Kenan McKinnon's work in Canada. And also following the Trans Law Center's model transition policy, but updated for more up-to-date language, so to speak, because I think some of the language from the Trans Law Center's policy is a little bit out of date at this point. In August of 2022, we brought that to the full committee and started to go through that process of the initial SME feedback layer. And then in March 2023, the committee finally felt like it was ready to be moving on to the broader employee resource group. And so it was sent specifically to the Queer Alliance for 2 waves of feedback. And we ultimately received over 100 unique comments and revisions and corrections made by more than 20 distinct reviewers. And so after incorporation of most of those edits from all of those different reviewers who chose to participate, again, over 300 people were invited to participate. Roughly 20 people ultimately chose to participate and actively make many thoughtful comments. We incorporated all that feedback and again, sent that draft policy with all incorporated feedback in May of 2023 to our human resources group. And then we had an ongoing series of meetings basically for the rest of the summer and early fall of 2023 between the ERG representatives, HR, and a city attorney on possibilities, agreements, revisions. What did HR actually feel like they could accomplish? And then HR in turn needed to reach out to our Bureau of Technology Services to see, all right, technologically speaking, how quickly can we accomplish a legal name change within our technical system so we don't have remnants of dead names floating through the technological ether somewhere, right? Because we have so many programs and so many places that a name might possibly show up. Again, we've got sites throughout the city. We've got 8,500 plus employees at any given moment. We have a lot of facilities. And so we needed to also do an inventory of all of our gender specific and gender segregated facilities throughout the city to see, are we doing everything that we need to do that, as Michelle pointed out, we had already promised to do 10 years prior in an earlier resolution. We did a final run through with the ERG group representatives and BHR in October 2023. And we did the mandatory notice demand to bargain issued to unions. And we had a broader public comment open on the rule. So anybody living anywhere could comment on the rule, inclusive of folks in the city, whether or not they were in the Queer Alliance group. And then finally, in January of 2024, we did finally pass that rule as final in City Council. So other recent legal changes that I like to point out that kind of dovetail into this gender non-discrimination and model trans policy, model transition policy that we have. Just for a little bit of clarity, in case folks are wondering, we have the gender non-discrimination rule, which makes it explicitly clear, because in any unionized environment, it is really critical to be explicit, but I think it's also helpful in any employment context, right? Make your expectations absolutely known, so nothing is assumed, everything is simply understood in black and white writing. Our policy makes it clear that you cannot dead name people, you cannot misgender people, you cannot out people, and if you do any of those things, if you're consistently misgendering folks, dead naming folks, you out them to other employees without their explicit consent, you will be disciplined under both 2.04 and our typical 2.02 anti-discrimination, anti-retaliation and harassment rule as well. And that's consistent with basically 20 years of case law at this point, which ultimately culminated in SCOTUS's 2020 decision in the Bostock trilogy of cases, where they held that Title VII absolutely protects LGBTQIA employees against discrimination that's based on their sexuality or gender identity. I think some people were surprised by the finding in that case. They felt that it came out of nowhere. But of course, all the people in this room, I'm sure, have been paying attention, because this is consistent with case law for the last 20 years. Even I think in 2012, Judge Pryor in the Seventh Circuit observed every single case with near uniformity among all the circuits that had considered, for instance, adverse employment actions being taken against trans employees on the basis of them being trans or them being consistently misgendered or dead named at work, that was being upheld as a violation of the law consistently across the circuits. So it is, of course, the law of the land now, because SCOTUS has opined on this, and no circuit could decide to the contrary, right? No individual local court could decide to the contrary. Interestingly enough, Bostock did only speak specifically to discrimination, which leaves separate and apart the issue of harassment. But even more recently, as of April 29th, the EEOC finally published in final the sub-regulatory document known as the new enforcement guidance on workplace harassment. And while there was a lot that needed to be updated in the workplace harassment document, right, because it had not been updated by the EEOC in 25 years, right? So the last time this document was updated, Rob Thomas and Santana's Smooth spent like 20 weeks on the top 100 chart, right? A lot has changed since then. Me Too, Bostock. And so the new enforcement guidance has made it very clear that the EEOC intends to prosecute these types of cases, saying that intentional misgendering, dead naming, outing, or denial of access to any sex segregated facility consistent with an employee's gender identity will absolutely substantiate a hostile work environment claim. So it's great, again, to have a policy like what we have now in 2.04 rather, that explicitly prohibits misgendering, dead naming, and outing. And some of your employees may not even be familiar, right, with those words or those concepts. So having that shared language and shared expectations in writing is so critical at this juncture. I always tell people, if you have an existing harassment training and you have not already incorporated an example of what is disallowed in terms of intentional misgendering, dead naming, etc., the EEOC guidance has this great hypothetical that lays it all out. So you could take this slide and pop it into your existing anti-harassment training so that you are covering that EEOC and Bostock expectation. So example number 4 from the guidance, harassment based on gender identity. Jennifer, a cashier at a fast food restaurant who identifies as female, alleges that supervisors, coworkers, and customers regularly and intentionally misgender her. One of her supervisors, Allison, frequently uses Jennifer's prior male name, male pronouns, and dude when referring to Jennifer, despite Jennifer's request for Allison to use her correct name and pronouns. Other managers also intentionally refer to Jennifer as he. Coworkers have asked Jennifer questions about her sexual orientation and anatomy and asserted that she was not female. Customers have also intentionally misgendered Jennifer and made threatening statements to her, but her supervisors did not address the harassment and instead reassigned her to duties outside of the view of customers. Based on these facts, Jennifer has alleged harassment based on her gender identity. And these are the exact facts from the Triangle Donuts case out of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania as of 2020. So again, highly encourage everybody to make sure this is incorporated into any existing anti-harassment trainings that you have.
So we got a lot of feedback after we passed these rules and policies, and wanted to share some of it with you because it is oftentimes where you're sitting in a room screaming at the wall, especially for queer people of color, where they have consistently felt unheard, unseen in their workplace. Oftentimes, even in the example that Anne just shared, that is not one example. I'm sure there are thousands of examples like that, just in Oregon alone, where people feel like something is happening, that they ask for help with their management, with their human resource, and have felt no support, no help, and have resigned themselves to just leave, to move on to a new job. We hear that. I heard that from some of the construction workers who were working on city projects that were hired by the city. So not necessarily city employees, but folks who were working on construction projects who somebody asked me, why do you use pronouns in your email? I don't want to do that because I know that it will equate to harassment from the people who work on my team. And this was somebody who worked in a construction team. And we had a really long, lengthy discussion about how they felt really challenged to be successful if they pushed against the status quo that existed in their organization. And so I believe it's our responsibility to continue to push forward and move on some of these, some of this legislation, both locally and of course, nationally, but do the things that you can in the box that you can manage and then move on to the next thing, I think is a good approach to it. But here are some of the things that folks have shared with us. Queer person in a non-legally bound marriage, changes to have a broader definition of family member for sick or safe leave impacted me greatly. The option to care for my loved one in times of need is crucial to my mental health and well-being at work. And we have a couple more quotes to share. And then offering bereavement for pregnancy loss helps break down many of the stigmas our society has built around this type of loss. And this was a really concrete way to turn abstract offers of help into real support for parent and caregivers. And I want to say one of the things that's really curious about our expanded family language, which is now state level expansion as well, policy, it doesn't just help queer families, even though some media members would like you to believe that. It in fact, some of the feedback that we got was from another affinity group that or employee resource group that I'm in, the Latinx group, where many of us have really large, expansive families. I personally do. And if I lost a cousin who I was raised with, that would be a huge loss to me. And in the previous city policy, I wouldn't have been able to take paid leave to go to a funeral, to go all of those things if it was a cousin. There was so much limitation around it. And so when we expand it to accommodate what was perceived to be chosen family is only for queer families, that's not true. There are people who have who family structures are not a nuclear heteronormative family structure, and we need to build our policies to be inclusive because it helps everyone in the end. And one of the other things that I wanted to say about that specifically is one of the presentations that Anne and I did about this resulted with a lot of attorneys saying, oh, but people are going to abuse this. Oh, you know, like folks are going to take advantage of this. If you create this type of policy, they're going to lie. They're going to say they lost their, you know, so-and-so and so-and-so, and they're going to take time off or whatever. And what my response to that is a management problem. That is not a policy problem. If you do not know, if you cannot manage your employees and their time, and you are not offering opportunity for people to take the time off that they need for the moments that they need, it comes down to management. And we should not be building policy around the 1%, the 2% of people who are going to abuse it, because then we will always have policy that does not line up with best practices. We'll always have policy that does not include everyone, because we're always trying to figure out the legal loopholes and then solve for those. And that's not what we're intending to do here. I encourage you to sort of think with the expansive perspective in mind of wanting to bring more people to work for you, work with you, and build policies that do that and address the management issues along the way. Is this my slide, Anne?
It is your slide.
Okay, so after let's see, we sort of covered some of this already. To get that decision maker buy-in, as I said, I went to chiefs, I went to, they went to their bosses. We did some one-on-one conversations with folks to talk through what this would look like, how we needed to get it across the finish line. There was one person singular in an employment of 8,000 or employer of 8,000 who seemed to have a problem with this, and sort of at every corner was trying to insert themselves into the conversation. And they were not a person in position of power and authority, but they were a person who, along the lines of having to edit HR rules, existed. And I will say sometimes one person can hold up an entire thing, and you need to do a good job. It's sort of like community organizing 101. You need to figure out who are the people who need to be bought in and how to ensure that those folks have the information and the accurate information is being shared with everybody. And then the naysayers, or the people who may try to stranglehold something from moving forward, that those folks get removed from that process if they are purposely trying. And I never had a direct conversation with this person to determine whether it was personal belief system that was making them compelled to stop some of this from moving forward. It didn't matter. We got it passed anyway. But it is one of those things that you have to take into consideration. If you aren't, the head boss, that there will be people who will try to stop things and put barriers in your way, and you just have to build your community around that within the organization to ensure that it continues to move forward. And then we launched the policy sort of with not much hurrah. It went out in a usual bulletin that comes out. We then launched it. I think we did a separate one too with some training options, and then we're open for feedback as well. So when folks if their managers or supervisors weren't necessarily implementing it correctly, that they could go somewhere to someone to have those questions answered and to ensure that it was in fact being implemented correctly. And a lot of the information that we shared, that Anne and I did, was through the employee resource groups. They were such an institutional part of not just editing and getting this policy to the finish line, but on the flip side of that, once the policy was in place, to really ensure that this was being implemented across the city. Because with 8,000 people and a lot of managers and supervisors who probably don't follow what's at council every day or don't read their emails, they need to be reminded that's in place. And by giving employees the information directly to themselves, and then going and talking to the ERGs and training them and talking to them about all of the new rules, it empowered them to then challenge their bosses if they were not getting the support that they needed.
All right, and with that, we'd love to hear any kind of questions that anyone has or inspiration for a policy you've been thinking about.
Hey everybody. I would just say one win, and we actually did this, I feel like a few years ago, so it's nothing new, but we don't even call it a dress code anymore. We call it an appearance standards, but it is somewhere that you will oftentimes find what a male should wear and what a female should wear. And we got rid of that entirely. It also, we're in a credit union, so we have historically, especially pre-pandemic, been a lot more professionally dressed. And again, that term in itself can be given so many directions, but we found that like opening things up actually helped our employees express themselves too. So we overhauled it. It's like a very, very short document with a lot of photos. If you walk into any of our branches, you will see hair types, colors. I mean, rainbow hair is welcome any day of the week, not just during Pride Month. And so that was an area that actually came through in a survey. An employee wanted to speak anonymously, and we ripped up the whole thing. We didn't try to just do like a piece of it. And so that was something we've kind of tried to incorporate is when we come across something that needs a change, don't try to fit it into the box it's currently in. It sounds like, and Michelle, it seems like you guys did just that, right? You didn't fit it into the box. You were like, nope, let's do it entirely our own way. We found success with that. And I know it sounds like it's such a silly thing, like an appearance standards, but we got a ton of really, really positive feedback from employees. Now we've got like under 400, so a little bit different number too, but really, really a lot of positive feedback that people were like, oh my gosh. And I'm happy. I will grab a copy and PDF it and send it, because I think if I send you the link, it will take you to our intranet and it will do the same thing. But I will grab one and send it because it's kind of fun. We have new edits coming out with our handbook as well that were just employee based, but it opened it up and made it really easy for everybody to have a place in there, I think, and then be able to express themselves in a setting that I think historically, when we think of financial institutions, you haven't always been able to do that. So just our little piece, but I'll PDF it and share it too.
Thanks, Miranda. I love that. I think it's great. And oftentimes it feels, like I said at the beginning, it feels really big. Like sometimes being this person in this body and facing what we face at the national or even international level feels overwhelming. So I'm going to speak for myself. And it feels like you can't do anything. And there are often small pieces that we can to make the lives better for the people directly around us that we see every day. I spend more time with my team than I spend with my family most of the days of the week. And so if we can sort of bite off those pieces that we can handle, that's great. I love that. Anybody else? Just a shout out to our friend Lex in the crowd. Hi, Lex. Lex is works at the city too in the LGBTQIA 2S plus group. Lex, do you want to introduce yourself and say all the wonderful, amazing things you do at the city?
Sure, but first of all, thank you both. Thanks, Anne and Michelle, for all the work that you've done to advance all of these policies at the city. I'm relatively new to the city of Portland, but I work in the Office of Equity and Human Rights, and I was the first person hired to work specifically on LGBTQ I2S plus policy for the city. But because it's a new program, it's actually a pretty multifaceted program. So we're trying to kind of like also payback help support a lot of the policy, the 2.04 policy that Anne and Michelle referenced, but also be kind of forward looking and building out our policy shop while also trying to do our part to foster and build better relationships with LGBTQ community members as well as LGBTQ community organizations, and think about how we can start fortifying the fabric of LGBTQ supports across the city, and also thinking about like process-oriented updates. So like less policy, but more like practical supports and technical supports for our bureaus and elected leadership at the city. So the LGBTQ I2S Plus program just actually passed our strategic plan because our work didn't really exist a few years ago, and with the help of yeah, Michelle has it right there. With the help certainly of Commissioner Mapps's office, we were able to expand into a 2-person program this last year, and are really starting to become a program that has a lot more functionality, similar to the San Francisco Office of Transgender Initiatives, where they have built out full programs around the training opportunities, like Anne mentioned how important it is to talk about this and onboarding and training opportunities for your employees. So we've been doing a lot of work with HR at the city to make sure that those topics are included right when folks join the city, and that there are a lot of educational opportunities throughout the process, and our HR business partners are well equipped to support employees in navigating a lot of these policies, or making sure that they're accessing the protections that they deserve, both in the city and beyond. So yeah, really great to meet you all, and thank you, ORPIB, for putting this great luncheon event on.